Good morning, AP Research students. Mr. Muller here, and in today's lesson, we're going to be talking about the second of the two most important components to any research, method or methodology. This is the way you are going to answer that research question that is focused, valuable, which has a proper scope, and is feasible for you to answer. Method is how you are going to answer that research question, and it needs to not only be feasible for you to do this methodology, but it also needs to mirror the expectations of the discipline you are in. If you are doing a psychology research paper, your method needs to reflect what psychologists would do. If you're writing a history research paper, you need to reflect what historians would do in research. So, let's talk about these parts of methods. Again, this is essential. This is the fourth row of the AP research paper. So, hope you're excited. I'm excited. Let's get started. Now let's take a research question from our last video on problem statements and research questions. What are the ill effects of cyberbullying and associated punitive measures implemented by 4 middle schools in District XYZ, a case study? Now, I said there were 3 things under that research question called approach, design, method. I said don't worry about that. That's going to be addressed in a later video. This is that video. There are 5 basic parts to methodology. Approach, design, data method, and I say data method instead of just method because it lets you know the data you're specifically collecting. Specific method, which is more correlated to the actions you'll be taking to answer that research question, and data analysis. You need to write that down. Approach, design, data method, specific method, and data analysis. All 5 of these things need to be answered and detailed specifically to be accepted to do that research. So, let's talk about what this approach, design method, specific method, and data method actually are. Approach, you've only got 3 options. You can say your approach to answer this research question is exploratory, explanatory, or creative. Now, most of you won't be using a creative approach. If you're using a creative approach, most likely you are in some sort of engineering discipline. Maybe you're in music or art. But most of you won't be using a creative approach because you're designing a solution to a problem. You're actually creating one. I had a student who did an engineering research paper 2 years ago who created a cheap, effective solar panel. And he actually made the solar panel and had to describe mathematically how it was being used and how much energy it was generating. But unless you're in an engineering field, you're most likely not using a creative approach. Exploratory approaches are basically saying you are going to be looking at a particular phenomena, but you don't quite know what's happening. You don't know what you're going to find. You're exploring this phenomena, this variable, this topic. Explanatory approaches say we know that this phenomena is happening. We're trying to explain its connection to something else. So the difference between exploratory and explanatory is exploratory means I don't quite know this phenomena and I'm going to find out. And explanatory is we know what this phenomena is, now we're trying to explain its relationship to other things. That's the main difference. Most of you will be using exploratory approaches. If you're using explanatory approaches, you're most likely in a science or math field. Design, lucky for you, you've only got 2 options, experimental or non-experimental. Now, you're going to hear me say this phrase a lot. It depends on your discipline. Just get ready for that. You're going to hear that a lot in class because the question you might be saying is, Mr. Muller, what approach do I take? Well, it depends on your discipline. Read the research papers in your discipline that you will be collecting. That will tell you which one you should choose. Now, experimental and non-experimental is the same thing that you would have heard in a biology class. An experimental design has a control group. A non-experimental design does not have a control group. But Mr. Muller, which one should I choose? It depends on your discipline. What do the research papers that you've collected say? Now let's get on to data method. This is where we're going to spend a little time actually dissecting the different options. You've got 3 options: qualitative data, quantitative data, or mixed. Now I'm going to give you a couple of spoilers. A lot of you will be choosing mixed data methods because that is the most common form of data method that's been embraced, especially in the last 30 years. Beforehand, it was a little bit more quantitative. Before that, it was even more qualitative. But typically, research that you will find in your research papers are mixed for the most part. And I'll talk about why in a few minutes. Now, first thing again, which one are you going to choose? Depends on your discipline. Check the methodology sections in the research papers you will collect, and you'll be able to see what are the common data methods that your researchers choose. If you see a lot of mixed or quantitative, don't choose qualitative. Data method is merely what kind of data are you going to get back from your research. So let's talk about those differences. Now, again, you have to know which method is going to govern your research and provide effective rationale, and this is the difference between a medium and a high on that fourth row of the AP research paper rubric. The difference between a medium and a high is that rationale. It's not just saying, here's my approach, design, data method, specific method, and data analysis. It's, here's the rationale for why that is the best choice to answer my research question. That's why I've highlighted this section. Make sure you make some annotations here. So here's the difference between quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative data is all about numbers. I sent out 100 surveys and used a Likert scale of a scale of 1 to 5 to assess students' feelings towards school uniforms. And out of those 100 recipients, 60% said X. Okay. That's all quantitative. It's numbers-based. It just means what you're getting back are numbers. I looked at 1,000 instances of antibiotic overuse at this one hospital, and this percentage demonstrated X. That's all it is. Qualitative data are things from, let's say, interviews or case studies where you follow people around, time diaries, focus groups, observations. It's not numbers. It's here's what I saw, here's what these people said. It's more open and flexible. So let's talk about the differences and why those are effective. Quantitative research, data research methods are things like surveys, lab experiments, questionnaires, again, things that you will get numbers back from. And qualitative research are things like case studies, observations, interviews, focus groups, and ethnography. These are things where you are observing things and you are making detailed notes about what is happening, whereas quantitative research is just numbers. Now, again, I said most of you are going to be using a mixed data method, which means you will be having some quantitative data and some qualitative data that you'll be collecting to answer your research question. Now, why do I do that? I love this picture because it makes so much sense. Quantitative data methods allow you to get a lot of information, but it's fairly shallow. It's like standing in a kiddie pool. Sure, that kiddie pool can, you could use a small amount of water to have a very long and wide kiddie pool, but it's not going to be very, very deep because it's not going to give, it'll tell you what data you're getting back in terms of numbers, but it really won't answer the why question. You'll just be able to say, oh, here's the observable data that we received back. Qualitative research allows a lot of depth. If quantitative data methods are like a big kiddie pool you would find at a big Olympic-sized pool where they've got a little kid section, qualitative data method is like a well. It could be very deep, but it's not very broad. If you're doing a focus group or interviews, or if you're doing a case study, you're not doing it for 100 people, you're doing it for 5 or 10. But it allows you to really get into the why question, explaining the phenomenon. The problem is, it's for a very small sample size. So the question is, could it be applied to everyone? That's why a lot of research uses mixed data methods. It allows for a broad collection of evidence, but within that broad collection of evidence, you focus on a few people to answer the why question. So here's an example. And I've done this in research for my master's degree. I will send out a survey to, let's say, 150 students about their perceptions on how a particular unit went, let's say if I'm assessing self-assessment. That gives me maybe a Likert scale. I could, on a scale of 1 to 5, how you feel about certain things. I could find the means, or I could do some particular data analysis and say, okay, here's the feelings from these 150 students. But I don't know why. So then what I would do is I would take 10 of those 150 and then do interviews asking them to explain their rationale. I would take detailed notes or maybe even transcribe the interviews themselves and try to find some correlations between those students. That allows me to get a lot of data from a survey, but also conduct interviews to answer the why question. That's why a lot of research uses mixed data. Now, the other thing you have to think about is, within that data method, are you going to be doing primary or secondary research? Now, I'm just going to make this easy for you. Unless you are doing maybe a literature discipline, you're mostly going to be doing primary research. Secondary research is using other people's research in order to identify a new perspective on a topic. So in literature, right, let's say I'm looking at interpretations of Jane Eyre or interpretations of Harry Potter. And I'm going to read all these research papers from all these different people about their interpretations and analysis of Harry Potter. And then I'm going to combine all of those different interpretations and say, well, one thing they haven't looked at is this, but based on these interpretations, we can now think about this in Harry Potter. I didn't actually read all of Harry Potter. Another type of specific method, and we'll talk more about this in a second, that you'll use secondary research on is meta-analysis, where you're collecting other people's research and then synthesizing it all together to have a new understanding of that particular topic. And I'll talk a little bit more about that with specific method. But again, that's the only time you're doing secondary research for the most part. Now, this huge giant list is all specific method. These are the specific actions you will be taking to answer your research question. Now, this is by no means the entire list of specific method options, and these are the ones all the way on the left, things like case study, causal comparative research, content analysis, correlational research, descriptive research. These are the actions that you're going to be taking. Now, I am not going to give you a definition for all of these, nor will I ask you to understand all of these. And by the way, this chart just goes, if you have a case study research, it's typically exploratory, non-experimental, qualitative, things like that. The reason why I'm not asking you to understand every single specific methodology is because your discipline will only focus on a few. Why would I ask you to memorize and understand 20 different specific methods when your discipline only uses 2? Which ones do I choose, Mr. Muller? Find out from the research papers you've collected. You will note in their methodology sections, they note specific methods. You'll notice there's only maybe 2 or 3 that all the people in your discipline use. That will be the pool that you're going to draw from. For instance, if I'm going to write a history research paper, I'm either going to be doing historical research or meta-analysis. If I'm going to be doing an education-based research paper, maybe I'm doing a case study, maybe I'm doing a meta-analysis, maybe I'm doing action research. I know the bubble that I have to stay in because I'm in those fields of discipline right now. You will find out what bubbles you have when you read the research papers in your discipline. Now, again, a note about a meta-analysis. And I'm saying this because AP Research made a big point of this last year. Meta-analysis is not, here's all this research that other people have done on this topic, and here are all the quotes that they've said about it, and here's my conclusion. That's an AP seminar paper, not an AP research paper. Meta-analysis, specific methods, mean that you have a particular way of coding all of those sources you're going to look at in order to identify similarities and differences between those sources. It is not, here's all the sources I looked at and here's the quotes they have. No. It is, I've developed this coding sheet that allowed me to investigate all of these sources, and these are the different variables that I was looking at, and here are the frequency in which they occur. It's not, here's all the sources and here's their quotes. It's not an AP seminar paper, and I'm telling you this because a lot of people have done this in the last couple of years. Don't fall into the trap. Okay, I'm going to stop. Last thing is data analysis. And again, I don't have a slide on it, and the reason why is data analysis is merely what do you do once you get all of that data, quantitative, qualitative, or mixed data. How do you then analyze it in order to have a conclusion? Things like regression analysis, things like ANOVA analysis. Now, I'm not even listing all of them, and I'm not going to ask you to understand all of them because your discipline will only use 1 or 2 data analysis methods. You will find that in the research papers you will collect and read. This is also where your consultant comes in, is incredibly important because I cannot tell you how to do data analysis for psychology or sociology or biology. I'm not in those disciplines. This is where you need a consultant that has a PhD in that field because they can help you with that data analysis process. The big difference between the first year I taught AP Research and the second is the first year a lot of my students had teachers as consultants and they could not help them with the data analysis, so they chose basic data analysis that wasn't mirroring the discipline and the research papers. And the second year, I made sure my students had consultants with PhDs, which helped with their data analysis, which made their research more viable for their discipline. I say this to say your consultants matter for your data analysis. So let's take a look at some exemplars here and see what I can do. I've got 2 research questions here, and by the way, neither of these are good, so I'll also be changing these. What information can we get from tombstones, and how does a nightlight affect nearsightedness in children? So let me change both of these, because if I'm looking at that first research question, and we're going to draw a little bit back from the last video, this scope is way too broad, it's not even focused, it's really not valuable, and it's definitely not feasible. If I'm looking at the second research question, there's an issue of scope, because what kind of nightlight, what kind of nearsightedness, what age of children, which means it's not feasible. It is focused because it's on one particular topic, and sure, it should be valuable for that discipline. So let me just alter these a bit. Oh, that's better. Okay. So let's take a look at the tombstone one. How do the birth and death rates of the East Springfield Cemetery, because again I have to have a proper scope, during the Spanish flu, specific dates, compare to West Philadelphia? Now, if I was going to get data back, it would most likely be quantitative, because, again, I'm not doing interviews, I'm looking at birth and death rates on cemeteries, so it's numbers, so quantitative. I'm not explaining a phenomena, so it's going to be an exploratory approach. There doesn't seem to be any control group that I could do for this, so it's going to be non-experimental. And it might be correlational specific research, and I don't know what data analysis there's going to be. But again, it's going to be difficult to do that just based on a research question and assess what kind of specific method or data analysis they would use, especially data analysis. So really when you look at research questions, and we're going to look at some in class, figure out approach, design, data method based on it. Let's take a look at the second one. To what extent does exposure to LED nightlights affect insert type of nearsightedness? Now I put that in there because I don't know different types of nearsightedness. I'm not in that discipline, but let's say they just choose one. In children ages 5 to 7. So it looks more exploratory. Maybe it could even be an explanatory approach. And by the way, this came from a research, or rather the training that I did in Houston years ago. And the teachers in this training had a 15-minute argument about whether this was exploratory or explanatory. And our instructor said it could be both. It depends on your rationale and how you justify it. So again, this is a little bit iffy. And also think, there's no real hard answer. This is the world of gray. Welcome to research. As long as you can justify your rationalization, it's acceptable. If I'm looking at design, it could be experimental, it could be non-experimental. They would just have to justify their rationale. And it could be quantitative or it could be mixed. So I would have to know more about how they're going to answer the question. Notice with that second one, I said it depends on a lot of things. But I would have to rationalize my decision for that. So in class, when we look at these things that are a little bit, it could be either or, I'm going to ask you for your rationalization. And that's fine. That's the learning process. Well, that's all there is for method. We have now covered the 2 most important parts of research in research questions and methodology. It's all downhill from here, actually. Everything after this is easier stuff that's a little bit less important in terms of research. Because once you have your research question and you know how to answer it, you're all golden. Well, hope that's everything we have for today. Hope you learned something you didn't know before. Thanks for watching.